Hello, I'm Brenda Allison, a bookseller at Barnes & Noble. And today I am so excited to be in conversation with Megan Abbott. Megan is an Edgar Award winner, LA Times winner, a New York Times bestseller, and the author of Read with Jenna Pick The Turnout. Megan's newest novel is Dorado Drive, and it's available now. It kept me up all night and made me think, and I think it will do the same for you. I am very much looking forward to discussing with her today. Megan, thank you so much for being here to talk with
Oh,
us about Dorado
thank
Drive.
you. Thanks so much for having me. So excited to get to talk about it with you.
Awesome. We're going to try and have a spoiler-free conversation today. And this is a crime novel, a noir. So we'll avoid any of that. But let's get underway. Dorado Drive is a story of sisterhood, money, privilege, and secrets. It's also ridiculously ominous and propulsive. Can you give us a synopsis of Dorado Drive?
Yes, it's essentially about three sisters in middle age who, for various reasons, are sort of in a moment of economic crisis. They're set in Grosse Pointe, which is where I grew up, which is right close to Detroit, as the auto industry was failing. So this is 2008, right before the bailout. So it was a time when there was a lot of financial stress everywhere, but especially in Detroit because its sort of primary businesses were closely. So they all had this sort of economic peril to deal with. And then two of the sisters become involved in this female entrepreneurs club, among other women in Grosse Pointe, which is a very traditionally very privileged community, as a way to make money. And soon all three sisters are involved in it, and it begins to take over their lives. And it spirals a little out of control.
Just a little bit.
Yeah.
So how did the novel reveal itself to you? You talked a little bit already about the financial situation in Grosse Pointe, about the sisters. How did you come up with this idea? How did it reveal itself to
Yeah.
you?
It really started, especially sort of, during the pandemic, I was noticing this sort of rise of, make money at home schemes, and is particularly targeting women, often using the language of female empowerment and sort of girl boss,
Mhm.
money at home. And I think it was a time when a lot of people were worried about money, obviously during the pandemic, and we're all confined in a home. So it made me think about when these moments where people become involved in these, at the extreme MLMs and pyramid
Mhm.
Ponzi schemes, and the sort of at the shorter end, just stuff that is just not going to work. It's not going to get you money. We all kind of know it, and everything in between. And I sort of started to look back at some of the history of it, going back to like Mary Kay and Tupperware.
Avon.
Yes,
Yeah.
Avon completely. Pampered Chef, and
Mhm.
it sort of floated through. It's not new, but it does seem to pop up during these times of economic transition, financial instability. And at the same time, I think, like a lot of us, I was watching a lot of these docu-series about, all that leggings and and oils and all these things that people were selling, and how they turned out to be illegitimate schemes. So I was really interested in that, and particularly how many women that of like middle class or upper middle class who were really feeling for the first time in their lives economic insecurity, and were becoming involved in it and almost treating it like they would treat their PTA meeting or their country
Right.
club.
Oh, there's so much to talk about. I want to get to the MLM pyramid scheme situation. But first, I want to talk about the sisters. I want to talk about the characters. This is a novel full of characters, chock full of characters. But at the center are the three sisters, Deborah, Pam, and Harper. Can you talk a little bit about the sisters, how they work together, how you view each of them? Let's talk about the sisters.
Yeah, and it's always like wish fulfill. I've written a lot about sisters, and I don't have a sister.
That was going to be one of my questions. I was like, you
Yeah.
have to have a sister, right?
Yes,
Wow.
it's sort of like I tend to write about things I wish I could be a ballet dancer. So I write,
Right.
it's sort of my thing. But I only have a brother. He's a great brother. But sisters fascinate me. I guess for the same reason close female friendships fascinate me, and sisters it's sort of magnified. And I think for Harper, Deborah, and Pam, they kind of had a kind of calamitous childhood, and I think that particularly bonds you to your sibling. And if you're, same-sex siblings like sisters, I think it all, affected them in the relationship to money because their parents had all this money and it went away. So I think we've all seen how you can have the same childhood and you have one sibling who just spends constantly and one who won't outspend a dime because you're kind of reacting to the same situation but in different ways. And so you have, Deborah, who's the oldest, the most responsible, the most cautious, and you have Pam, who married very well. Now she's divorced, but was really upwardly ascending and really lived the glamorous life for a while. And then you have Harper, who never really fitted at all, is sort of a lone wolf and never had any money. So it was an opportunity to explore women and their complicated relationships to money, particularly if you're Gen X boomer or older, when
Mhm.
getting married and your husband would perhaps be the primary breadwinner or manage the finances. And then the bottom drops out. And then you have to figure it out for yourself. So the three sisters all are more a way of exploring how it handles everything in a different way. And I also think siblings in particular, it's like you're all veterans of the same war that is
Right.
childhood, and so you have this shared that, and you have all these layers of passive aggression and loyalty and love, and they're all kind of laid on top of each other. So you can cut the deepest with your sisters. That when they're involved in this high stakes operation, you really see that all come out.
Right. In fact, there was a quote that I wrote that was, Harper thinks it was complicated like every family is, like sisters are. Your sisters will always break your heart, pierce straight to the center of it and split in two. And your sisters will always make it whole again. It's what we do, what sisters do. And that's what you were talking about, like no one like your siblings knows exactly what button to push at the right time. And if anyone else treated you like that, I'm not sure you would continue having a relationship with them.
No,
But
you're stuck with your
right,
part.
right. And here in El Dorado Drive, we get to see the sisters interact. And like you said, they grew up in the same house, but because of their age, because of their personality, they react to money and having it or not having it, how important it is in life, how not important it is in a very different way.
Yes, completely. I think for Pam, having had this great ascent to have this husband who had so much money, she really is in. I mean, sort of the kind of woman I am a fan of Real Housewives
Oh,
franchise.
sure.
And
Yep.
you
We've
see
all
these,
done it.
yes,
Yep.
we see these women on them a lot who married very well and sort of have lived in this sort of cosseted world for a long time, and then the divorce. They don't know where the money is. They signed all the papers, they never even looked at what they were signing. And now they have, in this Pam's case, this very contentious divorce and very volatile, and she's having to actively fight for what's hers. And so she has like a real revenge a part, money is never just about money. For her, money in part is about revenge. It's not just about restoration to privilege, and it's about freedom. And I think for Deborah, who has a husband who, this is like a lot of people in financial distress now, has a husband who's sick. So for her, it's quite practical. She needs money because the healthcare bills are out of
The
control.
bills just keep showing up.
Yes, exactly. You know what? That just sort of is a thing that grows and grows and grows. We've all been there in some variation or know someone who has. For Harper, having never really had a solid career, she loves what she does. She, teaches horseback riding at the country club, but she never had like most people in America, never really had proper savings, doesn't have good health insurance, doesn't have any of benefits or anything,
Has no safety net.
no safety net at all, and she has some debt, personal and and otherwise.
Uh-huh.
So they all, and that's all sort of. There's a little bit of judgment between and among them about why they're doing this and who deserves it more because of their choices in life, and that I feel like women can judge other women about that pretty intensely. Like, well, if you hadn't done this, if you hadn't spent all your money on this, if you, et cetera, et cetera. So becomes quite personal.
We've talked a lot about the characters, about the money. I want to come back to the money, but I want to go back and talk about the setting of the book. It's Grosse Pointe, 2009, the collapse and bailout of the auto industry. There's a lot of talk about like the before and the after lives of the characters. Can you talk a little bit about how you saw that, and particularly in this setting? And I understand this is where you grew up. This is this place very well.
Yes, and it really was because Detroit had been in decline through my childhood in the 80s. It was sort of, it is, I often compare it to that Rome. It fell slowly and then all at once. And
Right.
all at once would be where the book is when the auto industry bailout. But grew up during the slowly, where all the car manufacturer was going overseas, and all the white, first the blue collar jobs, then the white collar jobs went away. And everyone I knew in Grosse Pointe had someone in their family that worked for one of the big three auto companies. So after this sort of shrinkage of them, and this was, the Fords lived in Grosse Pointe. This was like auto industry. So it was this sort of sense of the end of empire, like the golden age was already past. I felt this growing up. People used to talk about like the 50s, 40s and 50s in Detroit, where it felt like it could become it was a major city in America, and that was all gone. So it was, in some ways, you only realize this after, a strange atmosphere to grow up in, where the golden days are past and now we're in a fallen world. That all really played into why, it's because it's really the first book I've ever set there, why it felt like it had to be there. And then it got infused with all my nostalgia and complicated feelings that we all have about our hometown.
Of course.
It's this mix of like, oh, remember Bob's Drugs? Remember that pastry shop? And then like all the like anger about like, if you went to this high school, it meant this. If you
yes.
Yeah. So it made an extra charge for me, which felt kind of exciting to bring into the book.
Yeah, it made me think about Middlesex is also set in
Yes.
Michigan, and kind of this very American story set in this very American place, and you're kind of doing that again here, talking about money and gender and all these ideas in this very American setting.
That's right. That's right. Jeffrey Eugenides is from Grosse Pointe. He went to the private school. I went to the public school.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So now we know.
Oh, yeah. But I thought that Virgin Suicides is also set in Grosse Pointe.
Yep.
Too. So, and he's
Girls Gone Wild.
Yes, totally. It's another set of troubled sisters.
Right.
Because now that I think about it, there is something very, I guess Midwest is sort of always been cited as a particular kind of American dream, the kind of wholesome quaintness of, and a place where people really still believed long after other places that you could ascend, that there was no such thing as downward mobility. It was ascension might be slow, but you would do better than your parents did. Each generation would improve. It wouldn't be a decline.
And here we're seeing a lot of downward mobility and the struggle with that idea that goes against everything that you may have been taught or you may have thought was going to happen for your life. And so we see that. You mentioned a word, and I have, it's like you've seen my notes about nostalgia. And I wanted to talk about that. Harper at one point thinks nostalgia is always a trap. It made you forget the things you didn't want to remember, the ugly things that keep you honest and true. Can you talk a little bit about nostalgia, how it works in the novel, how you see it? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's something I wrestle with myself constantly. I think in our digital era, it's predominant. Everyone is looking back all the time because we have this digital record of even like 10 years ago or 15 years ago, and that feels like a more innocent time. I think we're always imagining the past as more innocent, and now there's this nostalgia for the early aughts, which isn't even that long ago. Or, and like the particularly pre-smartphone era, when we all lived so differently. And I think I think there's a lot of danger in that, the way that it gets this amber, trapped in amber kind of
Mm-hmm.
magical quality, as if the past were always perfect. And of course, we know that that's not true. And I think for the sisters in the book, for instance, they do speak with great nostalgia about their childhood, but then we do realize through some of their conversations that their childhood was pretty awful because their parents were a mess. And I
Mm-hmm.
think many parents of that generation were not really parents. They were sort of your roommates, who were having their own psychodrama. It keeps them from dealing with what they have now. They're trying to get back something that you can't get back instead of dealing with the now. I think particularly true for Pam, because she's not going to get that back. That economy doesn't exist anymore. That world doesn't exist anymore. The three country clubs, that's just impossible. So if you make that the thing you want, you might start taking shortcuts to get there. And you're never really going to be satisfied.
Let's talk about the wheel.
Yeah.
So you alluded to it a little earlier. Talk about the wheel. How did you conceive of this? How did you come up with this
Yeah. This
idea?
is like, if I had a pyramid scheme, this is what it would look.
Right.
I started to think about, there's this sort of traditional MLMs where you're actually selling something. And in some ways, that feels more legitimate because you're giving people a product. But even if the product is a kind of snake oil, I think you can kind of justify that it's just direct sales and you're selling to your friends, and maybe they want these essential oils, or maybe they want these leggings or this jewelry. But I wanted to do what's actually much more common, and I think trickier to pin down what's illegal about it, which are this whole other set of money making operations where there is no product. You're not selling anything. It's all about social capital. It's all about recruitment. So you pay in. So the idea, I borrowed from many of these cases that have been prosecuted. They put all their indictments online, so you can really see how they operated. But they mostly seem to involve everyone paying in initially, membership fee, $5,000, say, as it is in the wheel, and then eventually you bring in more people and you ascend, and once there's been enough rounds of it, you're at the top and you will collect everyone's $5,000. So you just need to sort of wait it out and keep bringing new people in, and then the pool, then you eventually you're going to collect the pool if you bring enough people in. And so it's so simple that you can actually be puzzled. In fact, when I first was working on it, I had several conversations with my publisher, et cetera, explaining why it was illegal, but it is illegal. One could say it's like there's a technicality, because who are you really hurting? But like any pyramid, eventually there's just not going to be enough people to bring in, and people aren't going to be making money anymore. So that's the kind of operation that I wanted, where you could believe how they could think there's nothing wrong with this. This is women investing in other women. This is like day trading. This is like the things that men do on Wall
Mm-hmm.
Street all the time, right? We're all going to go in on this and we're going to ride it out and we're going to bet on ourselves. And so that was what interested me about it, that you actually, the only part that I think feels, that you get wary about is the classic thing, like, this feels too good to be true. you know we all know about things that seem too good to be true.
Right. I wanted to talk about too, like, who is who's coming to the table in these kind of schemes, right? Like, you talked about the leggings, and I've seen the documentary, and you see women, and generally it is women here in the story, it's women as well, who maybe don't have a lot of autonomy or independence in their everyday life, and this creates that feeling for them. So can you talk a little bit about, like, who's coming to this, and like what does it do for them, both in the novel and in society?
Yes, that really interested me because there's the obvious, you're entering because you need money, but there's so many other
There's like
reasons.
10 layers beneath that, right?
Yes, yes, and it's really interesting when you read about women, like you interviewed about why they were involved, because sometimes the last thing they say is the money, what kept them in it, at least,
Mhm.
because they definitely needed the money, and a critical moment in their lives, etc. Child going off to college, second mortgage, faulty, but there was this sense the first time in their life they were making money on their own that was completely theirs. And they felt an independence, some of them coming out of marriages or in marriages where they had no control over the bank account, even. I don't think this will be true for anyone now under 30. I mean, everything has changed so much, but that was extremely common that,
Right.
I mean, I remember having to show my mom, how, and she had to figure out herself after my dad passed away, how, in her 60s, how to, balance checkbook and, because the men, that's what the men did. So there's a lot of like, now I'm in control of my pot of money. Then there's also, I think, for many women, this feeling of solidarity with other women, can be quite powerful. You're all in this same, somewhat shameful situation, particularly for these middle class women who are trying to hide the fact that they lost all their money. But I think for any women, I mean, these are common in all income brackets where there's something so wonderful about being able to share with other women your anxieties, your hopes. And so there's this camaraderie. And then a lot of them do use the language of feminism that can be very intoxicating. You're going to be in charge of your money for the first time. Isn't this wonderful? Men have been doing this kind of thing for centuries, and now you're taking control of it. And I think that feels really exciting too. So I think there's so many ways to sort of get locked into it and feel like it's doing so much and feels so harmless and kind of wonderful. I mean, there's a lot of these, in the book, The Wheel is organized through a series of parties, and these parties become more and more ecstatic and wild because they're having so much fun together. And I think that is hard to let go of.
There's like 8 million things I want to talk about here. The frenzy of it, you watch the documentaries and these women all go to a hotel in Mexico and they're in a foam party and it's frenzied. And here in the book there are a number of parties. In fact, there's a little bit of a intro to the book, and then the very early chapter is a graduation party, and then you have all these parties for the women in the wheel. Talk about the parties. I want to
Yes,
talk about the frenzy of the parties.
yes, this is my favorite. I mean, I love to write party scenes, I will admit. And this is part of the appeal of this book is I would get to write a string of parties.
There's lots of parties.
Yes, it's sort of the whole engine of it is the party. And, having grown up in the suburbs, any of us who have, the big thing is hosting parties and then, like trying to, outdo the last party. And, I was looking at old Martha Stewart magazine, like how to host even better party and grander party and what you could serve that no one had served before. What you could, how you could, in these cases, how the money would be collected and what you could collect it and would be grander. And at the same time that the parties are getting grander because everyone wants to outdo the Joneses, right?
Mhm.
So there's a competition inherent in it, like you might find in other groups of women, like in a sorority or a sport, female sports. There's that, but then there's also, as it continues, there's a more paranoia and suspicion among the women because inevitably what happens in these groups is to keep going, you have to bring in more women. So you're starting to bring in women that you don't really know or that not everyone knows. So, and you're all counting on each other to keep it secret. It has to be a secret. And so once you're bringing in people you don't know, you have no confidence that they're going to keep the secret. So the parties get wilder, but they also get more
Stressful, ominous.
completely, yes. Yes. because you don't know, what's happening here. Who's this person? This person doesn't seem like they could afford to be here. That kind of stuff. Which really fuels it. Like when the onus is on like keeping the numbers up, and this is sort of the case. I did read a lot of like books on sales, and this is
Hmm.
the problem with sales too. You're to make your numbers. You're selling things to people for a certain point that probably can't afford it.
Like Glengarry up in here.
And I reread Glengarry to write the book. I was
Right.
like, this is going to get me in the headspace I need.
Right. And like that desperation from both the seller and the buyer. And you
Yes.
start to feel that in the parties, in the room with the characters. And like you said, it's not just the desperation of the new people, but it's the lack of trust with the
Yes.
people who have been here. Right.
Yes. Yes. And everyone has their own set of rules about who should be in it. It sort of takes on the quality of any restrictive club, right? Like a sorority or a country club. Are we letting in this person now? But you have to keep letting, in this case, you have to keep bringing in more people. So it becomes almost untenable, which
Hmm.
they all do. And that's usually when these things go, end up getting prosecuted, it's because someone was unhappy and when it goes to the feds. And then, so it
That'll do
really
it.
is, you should try, if you can smell a rat, you probably have a rat.
And then I also want to talk about the cult like language that these kind of groups use. Cultish was actually just a monthly pick at BNN,
Oh
and
yeah, I read that. Yeah.
she was on the podcast and talking about like the language, the in language these people use with one another. You have that in the wheel. And some of that you kind of already talked about is tied up in almost feminist language. Can you talk a little bit how you came up with the language of how they speak to one another?
Yeah, I had read a lot about these sort of code that they would use to sort of avoid. It's a lot based on IRS IRS language about what
Oh,
you
interesting.
say, yeah, and and about what a gift is versus an investment, and so a lot of it is based on using safe language and things you're not supposed to say, and that so I looked at a lot about that because they're trying to dodge IRS gifting limits about
Mhm.
and they're also doing this thing that this is usually what they get the mob, gang, organized crime on, the way that they deposit the money. You don't, if you deposit a certain amount of cash to your bank has to report it because it's considered unusual. And that's usually a flag. So there's all this language about to avoid anything that could signify that there's anything fraudulent or just trying to evade the law. So a lot of it's based on that. But I think some of the other language is to make it sound like it is a female empowerment club, to not sound like this is a money making operation. This is nothing so tacky as that. You know, for these women that, it's the reason they wouldn't be selling Avon. They would consider that déclassé, probably. Not that they wouldn't do it, but this feels like the language again of sisterhood, So a lot of it is to signal to everyone that we're doing something to support one another, and that is there's something so insidious about that to me.
Right. Yeah, they're like, "She knows her power, she knows her worth," and they
Yes.
chant it, and you can
Panting,
feel, like
always. This is
you
a
can
lot
feel
about
the energy, like, building.
it's sort of, I have a fear of group activities of any kind, so I think some of that, like
Oh god, this is your nightmare.
I know, anytime there's chanting, I think I'm out. But that kind of thing is a kind of bonding thing. It's like summer camp, right? The intensity of your summer camp experience, and so I think some of these also do call on past safe and lovely experiences of connection, but they also, I think, for they're used for to a very different purpose here.
So we've talked a lot about money and the characters and the scheme, but this is a mystery novel. And it is scary and makes me apprehensive. I was like on edge for a lot of the book.
I'm sorry, but good.
But that was good because I
Yes.
ripped through it. My husband's like, "Are you going to bed?" And I said, "No." I've heard Stephen King talk about how he used to write about like demon clowns and dogs, but now he writes about the truly scary things, real life. So you kind of talked about group activity, but what do you think the truly scary things are?
I think for me, there's always the shock, and this is sort of something that we all experience in life all the time in a basic level of, say, romantic betrayal or divorce, or either when you find something out about someone you've known a long time, even your whole life, that you never would have guessed, that completely surprises you. And it's one of those things they talk about that's sort of metaphorized in horror movies as like the zombie or the
Hmm.
vampire, because it's the person you know, but they're not the person you know. And there's something about that that really sort of chilled me to the bone, that people you've known, decades or all your life, and something gets brought on to open that, and that feels so terrifying to me. And I would say similarly, and I write about this in a number of my books. I tend to write about women in groups. I think particularly the intensity, like women, especially in past generations, including mine, we're not supposed to express aggression or competition. So it's all there, but it's
Hmm.
very just
But you
under
have
a
to pretend
layer.
it isn't.
That's right, exactly. So it can come out in all these surprising and upsetting ways. So that's another thing that really troubles me. And I would say too, having grown up in the Midwest, and this is a book set in the Midwest, there's really, in general, in the Midwest, you don't really talk about things,
No, it's all
especially.
passive
That's
aggressive.
right. Your feelings are, and you don't ask uncomfortable questions, and so inevitably things are a surprise all the time, and you don't really know. I always think of like the Coen brothers movies,
Oh
because
yeah.
they're from Minnesota, and things like Fargo or something.
Hmm.
Like the smile of the Midwesterner, behind that smile could lie a multitude of sins and crimes. So I think it is a lot about thinking you know someone and you don't know them at all, which takes a lot of forms. I think it's in many ways an elemental fear we all have, even if we don't call it that always.
And you kind of have all of these things here in this
Yeah.
novel, right? And we see that in a lot of ways. And one thing that the novel is about too is about desire,
Yes.
and wanting, but maybe not saying it's what we want, or maybe it's not what we're supposed to want for the reasons we're supposed to want it,
Yeah.
right? At one point, Harper says, "We always want other people's desires to be simple and defined: sex, love, money." But in Harper's experience, it never worked out that way. There were all kinds of wanting, and the seduction of the club was that it promised so much. Whatever you wanted and couldn't have, the club could give it to you. So I'd want to talk a little bit about how that desire fits into all these themes.
Yeah, I thought about it a lot with the fact that, it's with middle-aged women particularly. I think there's a line in the book where Pam says that women her age aren't supposed to want anything, right? Their mother.
Disappear and you're done
Yeah,
now. Your work is done
exactly.
here.
Yes, if you ever were allowed to want something, that era is gone, and now you're not. And so there's just something inherently forbidden about that wanting. And when you see middle-aged women expressing desire for anything, it's usually kind of pathologized or made funny. It's not taken seriously, or it's seen as pathological. So the desire never goes away at all. And I think the the wheel becomes, yeah, this sort of engine for all their desires. And it is really complex for just the ways we were talking about, in terms of it's the money, but it's also the camaraderie, it's also the sisterhood, it's the sense of belonging, it's a sense to having someone to share things with, it's for revenge, and it's for they like rebuild, like in some ways rewriting your life. A lot of these women are coming out of divorces or unhappy marriages, and wanting to start over. Harper has a bad romance she's trying to recover from, that she can't really.
Mhm.
It's sort of for her. I think it feels like the her desire cost her so much, and
Mhm.
now she's sort of literally paying the price for it. So I think all these sort of all these sort of trapped desires find this outlet at last, and like any lapsed Catholic, that feels dangerous to me.
Ooh.
I celebrate it, and it feels dangerous at the
Yep.
same time.
And I think about it even like in conversation with some other, novels that are bubbling around the zeitgeist today. Like you think about Miranda July's All Fours and
Yes,
talking about like that desire of the middle-aged woman that, until now, no one was talking about other than to be funny or like, oh, sad. And,
yes,
right. But here's this conversation of like, just because you're a woman of a certain age doesn't mean you don't still want things.
completely. Especially because in some ways, for these empty nest women coming out of divorce, is the first time in many ways that they've been allowed to want something just for themselves, and somehow that's unacceptable to the culture at large. It has to be like turned into, just think of the response to movies like Baby Girl or something, where
Right.
like there's something terribly wrong that and she has to be restored to some. It just feels like there's a kind of weird conservatism. I don't mean
Mhm.
political, I mean just sort of wanting to contain this desire, which shows how powerful it is, really, and how natural it is, but how uncomfortable I think it makes us. We expect men, in fact, say get divorced, empty nesters in their 40s and 50s. They're supposed to want the young girlfriend, the
It's
sports
expected.
car. Exactly. That's like it's so accepted that it's expected, but for a woman to do that, it feels, thirsty, pathetic, terrifying, grotesque, all these things.
Right.
Which is just it's a double standard we can't seem to shake.
Right. And you get to that point in life too where it's like this is what and so many of the characters in this book like this is how I thought my life would be. This
Right.
is what I was sold essentially. And I got here and it wasn't what I thought it was going to be, and in fact, it wasn't even what it was. And now they're looking for something else. This very midlife story of like, is this what my life will be?
Yes, and I think for Pam's teenage daughter,
Oh
Vivian,
yeah.
the different generation entirely, as a millennial, I guess, since this is set in 2009. She's just the nothing, there's no security for millennials. they,
Right.
they never grew up in a world where any of these things were believed to make sense. So she sort of looks at her mom and her mom's friends and doesn't understand it all. It's it's almost like a completely different species to her, which I think is, and in turn Pam struggles with her teenage daughter for seeing to be so free to want whatever she wants at that age. So that felt really interesting to me. These generational divides that we have right now feel so big because of so many changes in the culture.
But at the end of the day, they're not that different. Cause like
No.
at some one point, like Vivian says, oh, I never felt that way about money. I was surprised that y'all did. And then Harper thinks like we are all nostalgic for that money, but it wasn't that simple. My parents were drunks. They didn't
Yes.
take like it wasn't secure. It wasn't as great. Like it's not that different, but they look at it. So they think it's so different,
That's right.
right?
That's right. Because I think the cultural standards were different, and you didn't line up. But you have to remind yourself that no one could meet those standards. It's
Right.
so rare that there was this sort of perfect, 50s nuclear family that was imagined. This it you know the it was really, like a rare, like a unicorn. But somehow we're all raised with that, is that notion that this is what you strive for.
And it even kind of goes back to what you were saying about like the danger of that nostalgia, which is you remember it from the outside,
Yes.
not from the inside. And the
Yes.
book even opens with the line, all I want is to be innocent again.
Yeah.
And like, is that even possible?
Right. And what does innocent mean? That feels like in the category of nostalgia of, because I mean, we all know from we're young, it's technically innocent. Technically, I mean, we are innocent, but that all you want is experience when you're young. That's
Mhm.
one of the reasons I love to write about teenagers so much is they're on that precipice, and all you want is to sort of be done with your innocence in many ways. And then after, all you want is that back. So, which suggests that it's a fantastical notion to begin with. No one's innocent, and that's sort of what I think was the same as nostalgia in that way.
So no spoilers, but you write crime novels. Do you always know what happened when you start writing the novel?
I do. I know the basics of the crime and how it came about. But
Mhm. Yeah.
yeah, I have to know that. I will say it has changed sometimes, just because I don't know the characters yet. But rarely too much. Most of the things that change are built around the specifics of it and how it's uncovered. I don't know that, and that's part of the fun is sort of figuring that out and like when to. So I always want to think of the reader experience that sometimes they'll get a little ahead of the main character and sometimes a little behind of me writing. You kind of want that push pull where like, oh, I think I can't believe Harper's falling for this when and but then sometimes you're sort of, so I'm always, that part only comes as I'm writing it and then rewriting it and trying to sort of get that just right where, and that you feel like you're doing little smoke and mirrors, but you're also playing fair. You
Mhm.
never want that ending where it just feels like it comes out of nowhere.
Right.
That's the danger.
Are there any other like influences you had on the book, the characters, the ideas of the novel that we
I would
haven't talked
say so one
about?
of the surprising ones but was really strong was the movie Goodfellas. Which
Oh, I
yeah,
could see that. Yeah, the
yeah.
furs, the
The
furs.
fur came directly from
Yeah.
Goodfellas because there is a scene with a fur, and those of you who have seen Goodfellas know there's a famous scene where someone should not have bought his wife a fur coat, and he does. Because I did start to think because the way some of these groups are prosecuted is the same wire fraud,
Mhm.
tax evasion as organized crime is. Because in some ways they operate the same way. They're trying to hide money, they're trying to hide cash, they're trying to move it around. And so that's such a great, that movie sort of tells you how everything works in organized crime. And it also has such ecstatic moments, and then the sort of fall. So
Mhm.
I watched it again, of course, and then I even looked at the script to sort of
Oh,
so
interesting.
I and then I did, yeah, do a direct homage with the fur coat because it seemed like,
Oh, it's perfect.
I own my influences.
Is there anything else you want people to know about this novel that we haven't discussed yet?
No, but I'm excited about the possibility of women talking more openly about money and their feelings about it. It does feel weirdly so much still forbidden in
Oh
some
yeah.
ways.
Oh yeah.
I know in the last few years there's been attempts for people to sort of reveal their salary or how they, like these sort of public things about like budgeting and etc. But I think this some of this stuff goes really deep, and I think the more we can talk about it, the better. Because I think women say coming out of a divorce, and I think financial education. I was talking to someone about this recently. I mean, when I was growing up, no, there was no class. There was even not a unit in a class about money
No.
or like like checkbooks and credit and payday loans and all the things to worry about, all the sort of, so not that I don't consider this an educational book about money, but anything that can make you think more about like, yeah, this is such a forbidden topic. The fact that it's sort of forbidden, except maybe among our closest friends, means it's ripe for exploitation. People to be
Mhm.
exploited and to feel shame around it
Absolutely.
too, and not sharing their concerns with friends and family. So, I mean, that maybe sounds too high and mighty, but I would love to have more conversations about women and money for that reason, because I think money is never about money for men either, but I think for women it has these particular valences.
Right. And that's such a central theme of the book about money not being about money. And, so many of the women in this book come to this desperate point where, because of the foibles of men,
Yes.
right?
Yes,
And
true, true.
right? Like, oh, my husband's gambling. He was day trading.
Yes.
He, bought a fancy car we couldn't afford. And this idea, and again, it's part of it is generational, but as we see this kind of return of the romanticization of the trad wife,
Yes,
this
yes.
idea of like a woman not having autonomy over her money
Right.
and therefore her life, they're all intertwined, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, so true. This trad wife thing is sort of like the classic pushback against it,
Right.
and it's about nostalgia predominantly for an imagined time that never really existed.
Exactly. And it uses that same language of female empowerment. I think at one point Harper notices one of the women from the wheel and she's got her grosgrain headband and she's very, preppy white suburban lady. And she was like, I think she's becoming a radical,
Yes,
you know?
yes. I did enjoy that notion that, like, at a certain point, as you feel like attacked for something, you're really going to use that language of feminism, just like you're targeting me because I'm a woman.
Right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. It's weird how it's all folded back on itself with the trad wife mixed with the feminism. Some of this wellness stuff,
Oh, yeah.
feminism. So there's something really timely, I think, about all of this. There's a reason that we're all writing about this stuff and reading about it now, I think.
Absolutely. So we are a bookstore. So I would be remiss if I didn't ask you what you're currently reading and loving or one of your all-time favorites. Let's talk about
Yes,
other books.
I'm reading right now, but it comes out Tuesday, Ivy Pakoda's new book,
Hmm.
Ecstasy, which is, I guess, like a thriller with like a horror edge. Horror doesn't quite seem right, but she's an extraordinary crime writer, I guess she's
Right.
usually called. But this book is wild and a lot about female rage, and it has this sort of Greek. It's set in the Greek islands at this luxury resort, and it's a slender volume. It's so elegant, and I just absolutely loved it. And I just finished, and it's the second read because we're doing some tour events together. Laura Lippman's Murder Takes a Vacation.
Oh, yeah. Her new book.
Yeah, which is a lighter crime novel, but it's also about money, weirdly, because it's about a woman who wins the lottery, an older woman who wins the lottery and decides to go on a cruise. I always try to do two books going at once, and one's a little lighter and one's a little darker. You probably read more than one book at once too.
Always.
Yes,
Always.
yes,
Yep. Yep. And I'm
yes.
trying to mix it up for the same reason.
Yes, yes. It's if it's sometimes it's just not the right night for one or the other.
Oh, yeah. You're like, I'm not in the mood for this. I'm
Yes,
very,
yes,
yes.
yes.
When people ask me what to read, I'm always like, what are you in the mood for?
Yes, that's right. That's right. What are
Mhm.
you feeling right now? Yeah, I think it's been a really exciting year for books. I've also been reading a lot of biographies. I just finished the biography of R. Crumb, the
The
cartoon.
cartoonist?
Yeah, which was great, which was just fabulous. So usually when I'm deep into a book, I read a lot of nonfiction. So
Mhm.
just because I don't want too many voices in my head.
That
So
makes sense.
just finishing right now. I had never read Tom Wolfe's The Right Stuff.
Oh, wow.
Payback. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, talking about nostalgia for the
The
space
60s and
program
the space program.
before it was
Yeah.
overtaken by a private industry. But yeah, so yeah, try to read across genre too.
Cool. Lovely. Well, Megan, this has been a delight in every way. So
For me.
enjoyable. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the great questions.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.